This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome to Evangelical, a show exploring the world inside and outside the evangelical subculture. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. This is another interview episode for you featuring a conversation with Matthew Sheffield. Matthew is actually unique amongst my guests in that he comes from a Mormon background instead of an evangelical background. But I believe that a lot of what he shares will be very interesting to my audience because of the fact that he was deeply involved in right-wing media and has a very interesting group of experiences that really plays into speaking to this present moment that we're in politically and socially. I've actually been a guest on one of Matthew's podcasts myself. You will be able to find a link to that appearance in the show notes. But we actually cover a lot of ground in this conversation. We talk about Matthew's experience growing up within Mormonism, as well as why he decided to leave Mormonism, what led him into conservative politics and media, what led him away from conservative politics and media, as well as some of the things that we're seeing play out currently in this national election year. That's all I'll leave for you for now as far as a preview of what this conversation entails. You can follow me over on Substack currently at postevangelicalpost.com. You can support the show for $5 a month or $50 a year and receive ad-free podcast feeds, additional content, and much more that you can find over there. You can also support the show by leaving a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere else you are able to rate and review things. You can also listen to this podcast now on YouTube. I will drop a link to the YouTube feed in the show notes as well. Finally, if you are interested and want to provide any comments on the show, please send me an email at contact@evangelicalpodcast.com. I thank you all for your patience as I get back into the rhythm of releasing more regular episodes again. I still have additional plans for splitting off my book interviews into another feed and another release date as I expand what I'm doing here on the Evangelical feed as well. So keep an eye out for that in the coming weeks and months as we get closer to the launch of my book, which I am also very excited to talk about with you soon. All right, let's get into it. My guest today is Matthew Sheffield from Flux. Matthew is a podcaster, writer, and media entrepreneur whose work has been quoted and cited by many outlets, from the New York Times to NBC News. He currently hosts 3 podcasts: Theory of Change, Doomscroll, and So This Just Happened. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on to Evangelical. I'm really excited to have a conversation with you about part of your story and some of your work. We usually start our conversations on this show, and I usually start by asking my guest about their, religious or spiritual background. I really start with the really light stuff. You're my first Mormon guest. And this show is primarily focused on people who left evangelicalism, and in a little bit we'll talk about some of the distinctions and similarities between Mormonism and evangelicalism. But before we get into that, where did you grow up, and what was church life or faith like for you at that time?
Well, I should start by saying that I did not have a typical Mormon experience.
Oh,
really? So my father... So Mormonism isn't known nowadays as a sort of charismatic faith, but in its early years, it absolutely was. And there was a very, very big component of Mormon religion was the idea of personal revelation, and that everyone should be a prophet. It was, in fact, something that the second leader of their church said, quoting Jesus to that effect. And so my father, he really took that seriously and very literally. And as a result, he was constantly having problems with the local Mormon leaders, because that's the problem with everyone's having their own revelations, is that it's a little difficult to determine who has the correct authority, etc. And so as a result, I went to 19 different K through 12 schools.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And, at that point in the 80s, especially on the Mormon side, there wasn't really as much of a homeschool movement. So that wasn't even in the equation for us. And so, but we traveled around also in part because my father had an idea of doing a prophetic ministry on the streets of the United States. Major cities, he would go. So he was a classically trained guitarist. He was a student of Andres Segovia, who was, and still is, probably one of the, he's long since deceased, but, even now he's regarded as one of the best classical performers in world history. And my dad, he decided he was going to play guitar on the street and pass out religious material to the passersby. And so as a result, we lived in extreme poverty for most of my life. We were homeless often. One of my brothers was born in a tent. I had another sister who was born, my mom delivered her by herself at home. And, needless to say, no anesthesia or anything like that. And we traveled around a bunch. But as a result, I did get to see a lot of the Mormon experience, but just from kind of the outside rather than from the inside. So I went to a bunch of different congregations. And, in those years, Mormonism, it was a 3-hour weekly service divided into 3 meetings. And then there were weekly additional things that you could go to if you wanted to as well. And most people did.
So your childhood definitely had a lot of precarity. I mean, that's putting it lightly based on what you said. Oh, yeah. Were you the oldest child? What was it like? I guess looking at, say, family systems, how did that, and your number of siblings and moving so often and not having secure housing, how did that all play in?
Well, so I have 9 siblings. Wow, okay. Two of whom died as infants, including my twin brother, and who died of sudden infant death syndrome. And then, I'm the second oldest, and so it was definitely a challenge for us fitting everybody into our limited abodes often, and so as a result, I spent a lot of time outside. And just because that was the only place I could get any space. And so, I spent a lot of my childhood just roaming around on, riding my bike or walking pretty much anywhere. And so as the second oldest also, my parents always had their hands full. So, they just, in many cases, did not have any ability to focus on what the older ones were doing. Mm-hmm. And then, the older ones, we also had to kind of raise our younger siblings to a very large degree.
Yeah.
As well.
And so this is part of, again, my ignorance with regards to Mormon traditions and what is normative in those places. But is that type of street evangelism that your father was compelled to do, is that something that is common within Mormonism or within any particular part of?
Oh, no,
it's not.
all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I do know that the missions are part of it.
Yeah.
Like going on your mission once you come of age is part of a common Mormon experience. But this sounds like something beyond that, and that's I'm ignorant of a lot of the idiosyncrasies of Mormonism. So that, yeah, I was just curious there. It was not. Oh, I've lost your audio.
I had muted myself there, and I forgot. I thought I had unmuted. Yeah, it was definitely what we were doing was regarded as strange within Mormonism. And that was part of why my dad often had problems with the local leaders. So Mormonism is very different from evangelicalism in that it's centrally run. Mm-hmm. And so everything is centralized, at least in the largest branch of Mormonism, which I was in. But there are, many different branches of Mormonism, most of whom people have never heard of. but some of them, have somewhat sizable numbers. And, if they were in the evangelical world, people would think of them as, a very successful megachurch, regional megachurch. That's what they would be thought of. Some of these other ones. And so, but in our division of Mormonism, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, missionizing is almost exclusively done under the authority it is exclusively done under the authority of the Central Salt Lake bureaucracy. And so my dad kind of trying to recapitulate that older charismatic tradition, it was a constant source of conflict because, he had all the verses and all the quotes from the early leaders saying that this is what you're supposed to do. And, the present day leaders were like, well, no, we're not doing that anymore. And you have to do it under our chain of command. And so that was something that was a huge source of conflict with him and them. But at the same time, there were, he did, consistently run into people who knew the former tradition and they respected that he was trying to preserve. And so, but ultimately, the tension that he had with the leaders, it ended up in him being excommunicated because of his refusal to submit to their authority and do as he was.
Oh, wow. And did that happen while you were still at home as a child, or was that later on?
It was later on after I had moved out.
And during this period, was youth group culture like a thing within Mormonism? I know that I went to high school. Once I moved from my small town in Indiana to the suburbs of Chicago, I actually, went to school with some Mormons that I'd never had experience with that before. And I do remember that they had early morning Bible studies and things like that before school. But I wasn't sure if they had any. It was never clear to me whether they had that same sort of youth group culture that was really prevalent in the 90s and 2000s when I was there in high school. Is that a similarity or a distinction between the two traditions that you see?
It's a similarity, actually. So if you live in the state of Utah and some parts of Idaho and Arizona where there's large concentrations of Mormons, they managed to actually integrate that religious study into the school day.
Oh, yeah.
Which I don't even know how they managed to do that from a legal standpoint, but they did. And why evangelicals haven't tried to copy it.
Don't give them ideas. Don't give them ideas.
Nonetheless. Yeah. Well, and and they call that seminary, actually, is what they call it. And so high school students are expected to go to that. But if you're outside of their core area, you have to do it before school. And so most days in my family, and then my father also liked to give us a religious lecture every day. So most days of the week, we woke up at 5:30 in the morning.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. It was brutal. And the thing about me is that when I wake up, once I'm awake, I cannot go back to sleep. Once I have gotten out of bed, it's over. I'm going to be awake for at least several more hours. And so when I would go to these early morning seminary meetings, I would be the only kid who would be awake half the time. And so, the teacher would all the teachers loved me, even though I didn't want to be there either. I just couldn't go to fucking sleep. Yeah. So, but at the same time, they also did have weekday church events as well. So, and usually that was once a week. There was there were meetings for the teenagers, and they generally tended to kind of have a blended event, meeting first where they have both the boys and the girls together, and then they would have a separate thing for the sexes. And usually in Mormonism, Mormons, and I don't even know how this happened, but for some reason Mormons love basketball. And so often the boys' events were just playing basketball. That's what we did. And and it's funny because Mormons actually are extreme for a white religion. Mormons are very well represented in the NBA because of that culture. It is incredible how many white Mormons there are in the NBA. You wouldn't think that based on it from the outside, but that's how it went. So yeah, we and usually things would start off with a opening prayer and some refreshments or something, and then the two sexes would split off and do their thing.
One sort of final question with regards to this part of your story. As you sort of got older during those periods when you were attending these variety of schools and variety of churches, as you got older, were you able to sort of individuate a little bit from whatever activities your father was up to at the time, or was there like sort of an association on your part with whatever might have been rankling the local authority or central authority of the Mormon Church with relation to your father's activities? Like, was just does that make sense, that question, as far as like during these like youth events?
How distinct did I see myself from my father's version of it? Yeah, it was something that kind of, I think, ebbed and flowed over time. So ultimately, I mean, he, as I said, he gave us a morning, religious lecture every day, and we also had one in the evening. So I was thoroughly steeped in his worldview, very early on in my life. And so I definitely was more, I definitely bought into his idea that, the Mormon hierarchy, local leaders are not necessarily inspired. And, and then at the same time, he often, because he would have these conflicts with the local leaders, it did redound negatively socially on me as well. Mm-hmm. So because, so Mormons have a practice similar to Quakers in which every month they have kind of an open mic day of preaching. So anybody can come up and deliver whatever they want to say to the congregation. And that was pretty much my dad's favorite thing to do. And so, normally, and it's such a weird custom because, people generally don't really know what to say in those circumstances. Most people don't like public speaking. They hate it. And so, there's kind of this almost rote phrasing that a lot of people use, and then they'll get up and maybe talk for 5 minutes or something like that. But my dad would get up and talk for like a half an hour. And sometimes he would go on for so long that the leaders would be like, okay, hey, I think you've talked long enough here. Other people should get a chance. And he would always get offended at that because he was speaking with the Spirit. So how dare you interrupt when God was trying to do through him? And so, but those conflicts made it so that I can only imagine that the kids in the audience hated having him, talking to drone on for 30 minutes at a pop or longer. And so, they eventually realized, oh, that's Matt's father. I'm going to start treating him badly based on that fact. And so, it that only bonded me further with my dad's version of, interpretation of Mormonism, that I would be like, well, look, these are the kids, who are the sons and daughters of the leaders, and they are acting in an extremely unchristian way toward me, who didn't do the thing that they hate, and yet they're still, treating me as if I had any control over what my father does up there on the stage.
Right.
And so, so over time, it lessened my faith in the institution, but only strengthened my fundamentalist beliefs. And so when I got to the age of 19, where Mormon men are expected to go on a mission for the church, I actually didn't want to because I thought that, I felt bad at the idea of bringing other people into this environment, which was filled with uninspiration and persecution. And I thought, well, why would I send somebody to that when, and because Mormons also believe that you can join Mormon. So Mormons, of course, believe that no other religions are true, but they also believe that you can be baptized after you're dead. And so that you can still become a Mormon posthumously. So I thought, well, hey, I don't have to worry about those people because they can join the church after they're dead.
That's a good extra clause,
Yeah.
Well, there's definitely so much to your story that I don't think we're going to be able to touch on. You grew up under a lot of multiple extreme circumstances, but you are no longer Mormon. So what started to lead you away from Mormonism? That you, despite yeah, let's just leave it at that. No more preamble. What led you away?
Well, so one of the other, and this is a key difference with, I'd say I've never seen any other religion that does this, but Mormons, they have separate congregations for young single adults. And, essentially they are meat markets whose sole purpose is to get the members of the church, of the congregation, to marry each other and move off to the family wards, as they call them. And so, once I got of age, I started attending these because that was what it was expected of me. And I just found the whole thing disgusting, frankly, because I thought the idea of, just sort of, hooking up with whoever was there in your congregation, I found that distasteful. Because they especially because they tell you that, they depart from the traditional Christian belief and believe that marriage is eternal. Mm-hmm. So, from my standpoint, the idea of just marrying whoever came along and being stuck with them forever, I found that kind of repulsive, especially because as I had become kind of disaffected from Mormonism and maybe kind of embraced this both simultaneously more intellectualized but also more fundamentalist view of Mormonism, that I did not like Mormon women. I found them to be vapid. I found them to be, excessively submissive. I saw that they would hide their intelligence from me, and I just didn't like that. So, and so eventually, when one of my brothers and and we'll, I guess, talk about this later, but we had done a political project, and when that ended, we were able to start a company and start getting money, and we moved out from our parents' house. I was 27 at that point. And, when we moved out, my mom, she gave us a list of the local Mormon congregations and the times they met and the address where they were at. And it was like, make sure you go. And so I got both my brother and we got up in time to get dressed and such to go to the meeting. And then when I did, I thought to myself, I don't want to go. Mm-hmm. These congregations are ridiculous. And I looked over at him and said, do you want to go? And he said, no. I said, okay, well, then we're not going. And then my mom asked me, oh, well, do you still believe in Mormonism, in the Book of Mormon? And I said, I've never actually looked at it, the evidence pro or con. So I'll get back to you. And then I started reading about it, and everything kind of fell apart after that.
I had not heard of these separate churches for young adults until I think I stumbled upon something in the ex-Mormon sort of social media space, which is a sort of a sister or companion or whatever. It's a related space online to a lot of ex-evangelical deconstruction type things. Yeah. And I actually I think at least on TikTok, it was ex-Mo has a few billion more impressions than ex-evangelical does. But I had never heard of that. And that is fascinating. I think that there are some similarities in the way that Bible colleges, Christian colleges do try to pair off and encourage marriage from a very early age, but not to the same extent. It's a different degree of attention to making marriage such a key part of a young adult's life.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was really sickening to me, even as a Mormon, when I was experiencing it, because, at that time I was being routinely quoted in places like the New York Times, or, the Pew Research Center was researching what I was doing. And yet, when I would go to church on Sunday, I had a lower status than, a 19-year-old who had just gotten married out of high school. And it it just seemed idiotic to me that, that they would treat me like that, that I was somebody who, knew more about the scriptures than all the local leaders did. And yet here I was, at these young single adult wards, they have chaperoned events. And, then they kick you out of the congregation, I think, once you hit 40. But they basically, imagine, if you're a 35-year-old, never married person, you have a chaperone to stop you from getting too close to the ear dance.
Oh, dear. Wow. So what are some distinctions you see? Where do you see sort of similarities? And we have touched on this a little bit throughout our conversation, but where do you see similarities and any distinctions between evangelicalism and Mormonism, and even in the sort of stories that people who leave both traditions tell? Because there have been, a few high-profile ex-Mormons, including one of the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. If someone is into the Bravo space, one of the stars is a big part of their on-screen story is leaving Mormonism. And I'm curious, in your position as someone who talks about these things and who's been involved in media in various ways for a long time, what is your read on these two movements and even the movements away from them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say, they from chronologically, they really got started. They were planted in the same soil of, mid 19th century America. And, and as I said earlier, Mormonism was very, very charismatic in its early days. And, and the entire premise of Mormonism is that revelation continued or has come back to the earth, and that, and even though they don't emphasize, the charismatic as much, they still do it now. So you can have you're allowed to have revelation, but it is restricted to just you and your family. So you can't, that's basically how they got around that. And it's, it's a handier way of doing things probably than what evangelicals have no rules for this at all. And it's why they're so vociferous and fighting each other all the time. But I would say though, like that centralization though, it actually has helped Mormonism become less susceptible to Trumpism as well, though. Because the thing about any sort of charismatic faith tradition is that, when you have leadership, it's about submission to the leader. Ultimately, that's what it is. And so, but for Mormons, they already have their supreme leader, which is their prophet, their literal prophet, the leader of the church. And so that kind of inculcates them with some amount of protection when Donald Trump has come along and become kind of the prophet for many evangelicals. And, kind of because again, and we'll talk about it later, but, he became kind of the unified leader for many evangelicals, and Mormons, they can't do that because they already have one separate sphere of authority, and that person doesn't want to share his spot with Donald Trump, needless to say. And so it protected them in some ways, and so that's why actually you do see that Mormons have been the only kind of high demand religious group that has had a large number of people who are anti-Trump. And Trump has done worse in Utah than he has in any of the, Bible Belt states for that similar reason. So, so that's an important difference. But I'd say, another one is a similarity is that, just this idea that, the solo scriptura notion, that is at the root of Mormon theology as well, even though they do have an additional prophetic, authority on top of that. Generally speaking, their leaders are not out there, saying, "Oh, I was talking with Jesus the other day and he told me we got to do this other thing." They don't really do that anymore. And so basically everything does kind of go back to, well, what does the Bible say about this? What does the Book of Mormon say about that? And, and so that definitely is a big commonality. And then probably the other major commonality is the Christian nationalism. And what I think a lot of evangelicals don't know is that Mormons started Christian nationalism. The evangelicals got Christian nationalism from the Mormons.
Yeah, say more. Say more.
And yeah. Well, and I wouldn't ask anybody to read the Book of Mormon because it's really boring and terrible, the writing. Mark Twain actually called it chloroform in print.
Oh, my goodness.
He wasn't wrong. But nonetheless, Christopher Columbus is a character in the Book of Mormon. He is seen in a vision by one of the Book of Mormon prophets, and God inspired him to discover America. And, other American figures are vaguely alluded to in this vision as well. And so, it's used in the purpose of creating this idea that God has decreed that this entire hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, the people who are allowed to have civilizations here must worship Jesus. And if they don't, they will be destroyed and left to wander in the wilderness and live a nomadic, cursed lifestyle. And, that idea is really the core of all of Mormonism. And, it was not a principle that was common in evangelicalism for its early history, especially after the John Scopes trial of the 1920s. Even though Scopes was found guilty and not allowed to teach evolution in Tennessee, the worldwide ridicule that brought to evangelicals and, Southerners generally, it made a lot of them kind of decide, well, this world is forsaken. Only God can redeem the world. We cannot.
Yeah.
And so we need to focus on ourselves.
Yeah, it caused a lot of, it made them become insular. They didn't necessarily, for a long time it was framed as a retreat, and that a lot of scholars have pushed back on that because actually they started really even more in building their own alternative institutions, which now are a century old. So, yeah. But you're right. Yeah, they lost the public opinion. I mean, they won the court fight, but lost public opinion, and that was definitely a turning point for the fundamentalists at that time, for sure.
Yeah, and basically though, in the 1950s and 60s though, as the United States began kind of pushing a propaganda, operation against the openly atheistic Soviet Union, there began to be these kind of traveling revival circuit people like Billy James Hargis or some of these early, Billy Graham actually was another one. There's a lot of these early, mid-century evangelicals and fundamentalist types that, they decided they had to convert, they had to save America, otherwise the communists were going to win. And as part of doing that, they actually put aside a lot of the prejudices that they had developed against Mormons and invited some Mormon figures into these revival shows as well. And one of the key figures in that was a guy named Ezra Taft Benson, who was Dwight Eisenhower's Secretary of Agriculture. He was the only cabinet official throughout all 8 years of the Eisenhower administration. And he helped him really, and he was kept there because he really kind of anchored down the right flank for Eisenhower, and that's why he kept him there. But he was very key in bringing in the Mormons and the evangelicals together, and also boosting up the John Birch Society, which was heavily Mormon and heavily evangelical, and was later actually significantly run by a member of his family. Had a top executive position in the Birch Society. And they were very Western focused as well, which of course Mormons were, especially in those days. And so that synergy eventually kind of found its way into evangelicalism, and the apocalypticism, the idea of the rapture or the last days, all of those were imported from Mormonism. The church itself is called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because this is the last days, and we're in it. And we have to spread the gospel to stop people from being taken over.
Yeah. I think the as far as apocalypticism, I'm sure there was a lot of resonance between earlier evangelicals and Mormons, especially around like the rapture and dispensational premillennialism that really popped off in the 19th century and is still with us today through things like Left Behind. So yeah, thank you for elaborating on that and really helping to flesh out that Mormon evangelical Christian nationalist connection. One of the things that of how I like to frame what really interests me these days is really how people change their minds and why people change their minds. And that is largely a part of what these stories are. In addition to you being raised Mormon and no longer practicing Mormonism, you also have, as part of your story, you were involved in a lot of right-wing media type activities, and then now you're in a different place. So I'd love to hear at least in part some of that journey too, and like how you got involved, and then the evolution of your involvement, and then what you're sort of up to now.
Sure. Well, and I should say that I'm working on a memoir about all this stuff. So if anybody wants to see the fuller story, I haven't bored you enough.
No, you
can check out that book when it comes out. But I'll say, yeah. So my interest in right-wing politics, it got started when I was a Mormon and living with my parents and my brother and I that I had moved out with later. He and I started a website against the CBS Evening News anchor Dan Rather, and we got the idea because, in those days, our every family had a different random TV channel that they that they watched for the evening news, and my parents, for whatever reason, they watched CBS, and we didn't like what they were saying about Kenneth Starr of the independent counsel who was going after Bill Clinton in those days. Mm-hmm. In the 90s. And so my brother thought, well, I want to make a website against him, Dan Rather. And I had just developed one of the first student newspaper websites in the country. And so, I was all gung-ho about it. I said, well, let's not just have a page against him. Let's make an entire website against him. So we spent months researching him and his quotes and on a variety of issues, and we put them all out there, and we called the site ratherbiased.com. And the site, needless to say, was extremely popular among Republicans. And, the internet was a much smaller place in those days. If you built it, people would come. Like, you literally did not have to do any marketing.
Yeah.
And so, we had all kinds of people. They loved Fox News promoted the site all the time. Rush Limbaugh promoted the site all the time, and all these other people. And then eventually Rather had this scandal where he used forged documents in the story. They were obviously forged documents made in Microsoft Word, but he claimed they were made in the 70s. So it was really embarrassing for him. And he basically got fired because of it. And, that was, at that point, our belief in our father's sort of prophetic ministry had kind of collapsed, because all the things that we were doing were working, but none of the things that he was doing were working. And so we thought, well, all right, we need to get out of here and start our own thing. So we originally were trying to we actually had the business model for the website Mediaite in 1990, but we couldn't get anybody to fund it because we didn't know anybody, and we didn't have it, and we sure as hell didn't want to stay with our parents anymore to make it. And so we were like, well, okay, I guess. And then because we had traveled so much, we didn't have any connections at all. We had no friends from college, no professors to help us, network. No, we never had an internship, never had any kind of job. So basically, we both thought, well, I guess we'll have to hook up with these right-wing media people because we have nowhere else to go. And we didn't really like that idea, to be honest, at first, because, we went in with eyes open a little bit because we were Mormon. We saw the evangelical and Catholic extremism. We looked at askance at that. We didn't like that, but we thought, well, but they have money, so we're going to go over there. And so we did. And, over time, I built a consulting company and created a bunch of other popular right-wing websites, several of which exist today. Sorry about that, guys. But in the course of doing that, I started writing a book for a publisher about, this was one of those, here's how my party can do better type books. And, I had left Mormonism by that point, and I was really into the content of conservative atheists like Sam Harris or Bill Maher, who, of course, don't realize that they're conservative. And because, in their minds, if you're not religious, then you're not conservative. That's all that means from their standpoint. But, I saw myself in them, and I knew that that's not what it was. And so anyway, but I was really into that stuff. And so I started writing a book about, trying to argue for the idea that Republicans need to stop with the Christian nationalism stuff. That term wasn't used, so I started writing this in 2012, and, the term Christian nationalism was used back then.
Yeah, it's definitely the thing we've all sort of landed on over the last 4 years.
Yeah, and so basically the thesis of the book was that conservatism as a philosophy is not inherently religious, and in fact, if you look at the history of the philosophy, there's many people who were not, and some of whom were anti-religious, like Edward Gibbon, and many of whom were maybe not hostile toward religion, but definitely did not like Christianity, such as George Washington. And I found a story of George Washington, which is not heard enough, and it's one of my favorites, which is the story of why George Washington never took communion.
No, I haven't.
Yeah. So what it was, so George Washington was, a deist, basically, like many of the American founders, and he was emphatically not Christian. He rejected Christianity, but not publicly, though, because he thought it was useful for the common person, kind of a shortcut to good behavior, if you will. And so he would go to church to set an example for the community, and he was going to this Congregationalist church, and the rector noticed that every Sunday, when it was Communion Sunday, so once a month, when they would get up to say, okay, now we're going to start doing, playing the music or whatever, Washington and all of his staff would leave every time. And the rector, it was caused quite a disturbance because, he had been the president. And so I'm sure his entourage had to take at least a whole row.
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe more. And so the rector came to him one day and he said, okay, so I'm kind of mortified to say this to you, but it's very disruptive when you leave for communion.
Can you stick around, please?
Yeah. And Washington said, well, you're right. I am sorry about that. It will never happen again. And for the rest of his life, he never attended church on Communion Sunday anyway.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's one way to solve it.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
So I had all kinds of stories like that in the book. And I begged my Christian nationalist colleagues to, I said, look, if I'm wrong about this stuff, show me where I'm wrong. What is wrong about this argument? Where my facts are wrong? What is it? Tell me what you don't like about it or how I can improve it. Because I want to make sure that I want you to understand that I'm not telling you to go away or anything. I'm just saying it's time to accept pluralism and time to accept that people are not fundamentalists and that they want, same-sex marriage and that they are not in favor of killing the Department of Education or whatever. And I never got any response from people. And unbeknownst to me, one of the people that I had shown it to, he started trying to get me fired from one of my clients. Yeah,
jeez.
After I had shared my manuscript with him. Because, but of course, they're against cancel culture. Remember that.
Yeah, sure.
And yeah, and so, in the course of writing it, I was just getting no feedback of any kind and, and getting people trying to fire me and eventually I realized I can't. And I was doing other projects and trying to, get funding for them and whatnot. And eventually I realized they don't support me because I'm not like them. And I thought back to a friend of mine when I had first come to DC as identifying as a secular conservative. He said to me, I'm not sure I would put on my Facebook profile agnostic atheist. People aren't going to like that if you do. And I said, who cares? I wouldn't want to work with them anyway. But unbeknownst to me, that was pretty much all of them. And so, it was, coming to that realization was a protracted and really painful process. And, you know, I had written over 400 pages of this manuscript, and my editor absolutely loved it. And he's edited hundreds of books.
Mm-hmm.
He said this was the best one he had ever edited.
And, you know, but everybody else wouldn't engage with it at all. And I got to the point where I realized I could, you know, what I have in here, it could be the best book ever written by anyone, and it wouldn't actually matter. They wouldn't find it persuasive because, in fact, they are just like my dad in that they see themselves as, you know, carrying out God's will and being God's servants. And so, you know, me telling them, well, you're doing this or that wrong, or here's how you could do better, it means nothing. It's just so much noise. And, you know, and then the last part of the book was, here are things that the right wing can do to become more powerful politically. And, you know, I got to the point where I thought they will throw away all of the book except the last chapter. And I will have actually made things worse with this book. And that was extremely depressing. And I was actually diagnosed with depression during that time because I was slowly my business was being strangled by these Christian nationalists. And, you know, and I just found it harder and harder to get work. And, you know, and eventually I realized I can't publish this book in good conscience. I'm going to have to withdraw this, even though I have spent years writing it. I cannot do it. And so I started publishing pieces of it that I still believed in, like research and whatnot. And eventually I just started a website. And this was before Substack and before Never Trump. And so, you know, I just started publishing this stuff, and eventually Salon saw some of my work and they republished some of it, and it was, you know, enormously viral for them. And I ended up with a job from Salon, and you know, it was, and I felt good about it. Like, it was not any sort of, I realized that these people could not be reasoned with. They have to be stopped. And so that's where I am today.
Yeah. Let's cling to that thing that you just mentioned of not being able to reason with some of these people, because actually we're talking on Super Tuesday. So there's a lot going on publicly and politically. And there are a couple of pieces that have been published recently. One was some analysis from what happened in South Carolina that really flagged that evangelicals continue to show up for Trump in the primary seasons. Another one, though, that you just published over on Flux is called "Trump Superfans Are Impossible to Argue With Because They Don't Actually Believe in Logic." So I'd love to start there with your most recent piece. And what you flag in the introduction of this piece is that there was an anti-Trump group that was focus grouping some ads. And this is a Republican group. This is an anti-Trump Republican group that was trying to develop these ads to speak to fellow conservatives. And you quote, and says you quote one of the developers of this campaign: "Every traditional post-production ad attacking President Trump either backfired or produced no impact on his ballot support and favorability. This includes ads that primarily feature video of him saying liberal or stupid comments from his own mouth." And then you start there and then explore how authoritarianism relates to this, and how it's often rooted in a biblical text, and then very, very prominent or common in religious spaces. Let's talk about that a little bit, and how authoritarianism really supersedes reasonable arguments for a lot of people.
Sure. Yeah, well, basically, I think that, so lately, well, maybe not lately, but, you know, ever since Trump won, a lot of people have been correctly linking him to the idea of the tradition of fascism, European fascism, Italian or German, etc. And the point of my piece in writing that is to say, yes, that's right to say that, But really what we're dealing with is a much older tradition. And it's one that's more psychologically rooted than anything else. And it's as old as humanity, this is a tradition of authoritarianism, which, if you look at ancient religions, the leaders, there was no separation of church and state. And that in many cases, the leader was a divine incarnation. So like in ancient Egypt, that was who the Pharaoh was. The Pharaoh was, in fact, an incarnation of a god. And, or they were the descendants of a god. And, and that was how ancient Israelite polytheism worked as well. And, as Israelite polytheism evolved into Judaism, obviously they had to drop the divine incarnation, the leader. But what they did instead was to say that, well, the leaders are prophets and they are the direct, servants of God, because God's not here. He's not a physical form going out there and telling us to do this or that. The days of the burning bush and the cloud following the Israelites around at night are gone. And so instead we have to rely on his servants. And, that is a very dangerous idea, because basically it tells people that, when you tell people that God is the source of all morality, that means that whoever controls what God says, they control all morality. And, and that is a point that's talked about in the Bible extensively. And I think the biggest illustration of that, everybody's heard the idea of Abraham and Isaac, the sacrifice of Isaac. And that, God tells Abraham to burn his own son to death. And then at the last second intervenes, and people, see that as a positive tale of obedience, although, I've heard since publishing that piece from a number of people who were young boys at the time when they read it, and they thought, wait a second, my parents think it's okay to kill me if God tells them to? And that was a turning point.
Yep. And Kierkegaard just wrote Fear and Trembling, and it's like reading someone's panic attack. So much of it is about that story.
Yeah, no, it's an abhorrent story. But people can generally kind of rationalize it away by saying, well, God didn't actually make him do it. But later in the Bible, in Judges chapter 11, there is the story of Jephthah, who was one of the judges. And he makes and nobody, for good reason, you never hear about this story in church, which is that, so he was trying to perform some of the genocides that were divinely mandated in the Bible. And he was going after, I think it was the Ammonites. And he made a covenant with God. And the Bible is explicitly clear that the Spirit of God came upon Jephthah. So God made him do this, inspired him to make this covenant, that if God would deliver the enemies into his hands, he would kill the first being that he saw greeting him when he returned home safely, that he would perform a burnt offering. And God keeps his end of the bargain. And so Jephthah returns home, and he sees his only child, his daughter, comes to greet him. And he mourns, and he says, how could you have done this to me? Mm-hmm. Because the idea of having to burn his own daughter to death is monstrous. And his daughter says, no, it's okay. Just let me mourn my virginity in the mountains with my friends for a while, and then you can kill me. And so she does. She goes and hangs out with her friends and in the mountains, and then she comes back and he burns her to death. And that's the end of the story. And yeah. That
one is not highlighted in a lot of flannel graphs. It's not a morally straightforward or theologically straightforward story. And but it does speak to what we can see even in the behavior of some parents today who choose a religious interpretation over their own children. And that happens in a lot of respects, whether it's over a political disagreement or not seeing the wholeness of their children and their sexuality or gender expression. There are some unfortunate modern parallels to to be drawn
Oh, yeah.
from that. But it does highlight this, as you said, that if this authoritarian view that privileges a particular person or perspective as sort of the font of authority, it's not to some vague sense of truth, or even a very clear and delineated and provable sense of truth. One of the things that you highlight, and I'm quoting you here, the implications of this moral hierarchy extend beyond the political sphere, influencing social norms and behaviors. It fosters an environment where power and authority are the primary determinants of moral worth, encouraging a culture of submission and conformity. What do you think we can draw from? And I'm not like forcing you to like find the silver lining or anything. Let's be sort of realistic. What do you think we can draw from through another national election year where these things are going to be part of the focus of the media? It's going to be amplifying a lot of these things, whether it intends to or not. What do you think listeners should draw from how this relates to conservative politics, and how that type of politics can be met by any sort of opposition?
Yeah. Well, I guess I would go to the back to the anecdote that I told at the beginning of the piece, which is this group was, trying to run ads against Trump, and they found that ads directly against him could not work. But when they ran ads that showed individual people in the stories and their own stories of discontent or confusion or whatever their disaffection was with Trumpism, those were more effective. And that's what I would say is worth looking at, because the idea of Trumpism. So, well, a lot of this, the absolute adoration of Donald Trump by so many, very religious people, they didn't necessarily start off that way. And in fact, they didn't like him at first. They liked Ted Cruz at first, most of them. And so, but they came to like him, and they came to like him because they don't think that there is a place in this world for them, for people who have their beliefs. And a lot of that is pure ignorance, because in fact there are many Black Americans who have perhaps even more theologically conservative viewpoints than a lot of these alienated white evangelicals. So they're wrong to believe that, because these conservative Black evangelicals exist just fine within the Democratic Party. Nobody's persecuting them. Nobody's telling them to shut up or go away. That doesn't happen. But they don't understand that, and it's because they haven't learned that it's okay to have a different opinion from somebody else. And so that's, I think, is the way that and I kind of talk about this at the end of my article, that focusing on peripheral, the motivations behind this authoritarianism, that's how you defeat it, because you can't defeat it directly, because they have given themselves emotionally, psychically, spiritually to Donald Trump. He is their world in a sense. And that's not an exaggeration. Like, defending him, believing in him, that is their existence for a lot of these people. And I'm not talking about every, casual Trump voter or somebody who might not like him. I'm talking about the real core, deep, QAnon believers, that he is their world, because of facts and morality, everything flows from the top, and he is the top. And so therefore he can do no wrong. And so most of them don't have the intellectual fortitude or the psychic strength to challenge, to hear somebody, to even contemplate the idea that they might be wrong, that the leader might be corrupt or evil. Because to even think that it's anathema. It is spiritual death. And, and I think sometimes people who are critics of Trump, they don't understand just the real depth of adoration that his supporters feel for him and why they do. And so they can't handle a direct confrontation or a direct criticism. They're just too weak for it. He encourages that weakness. So you need to focus on kind of exposing, some of these lower level MAGA grifters, people ripping off supporters with, fake books or medicines, or there's just a variety of things you could look at. Steve Bannon stole, hundreds of thousands of dollars from his supporters, and he was convicted in court of it. This is not, just a hyperbole. Like this, that he was pardoned by Donald Trump, he would have gone to jail for what he had done. But letting people know that these, focusing on the other figures who don't really have authority, because that's the weakness of Trumpism, is that because he has centralized all authority, all these other people are just out there alone, and they can be criticized fairly, and even by the metrics of MAGA, they will accept that, even if they may not always believe it. Mm-hmm. But it's easier to go after those people. And then once you've, exposed and once you've gotten them to accept that there can be other people out there who claim to speak for your values, who are actually con artists, then, it's an easier trip to realize, well, what if that's true about Donald Trump?
Mm-hmm. And even do you feel that there is any growing part of folks who may be part of the more conservative media ecosystem that are beginning to feel isolated from the driving Trumpism that often vetoes things like literally within the Congress, which I forget. I think it was. I apologize. I'm blanking in the moment. I believe it was some immigration work that was being done in both houses was really gaining a lot of bipartisan steam, and then came to a halt because Trump, who is the forerunner, spoke out against it, and effectively, and no one that is currently elected, especially in this election year, wanted to go against what Trump was saying, and so that effectively killed a lot of the momentum that was behind that particular push. And if I'm wrong, please correct me, or I might have to correct myself in the show notes. Okay, because I couldn't remember which particular policy issue it was in the moment. But do you see that sort of disaffectedness? Because there are lots of reasons why a lot of people on the more progressive or liberal or leftist side that part of the spectrum, there's a lot of disaffectedness going into this election because of Gaza and the US, continued U.S. support for that, and a desire to denounce the genocide that's happening there, and that not being satisfied at all by the current administration. But do you think that there's any level of disaffectedness that's going to impact things on the conservative side, or will we just see the people that are in the bag for Trump continue to stay that way up to the election, or is it just too early to know?
Well, I mean, initially you would ask me about whether people in right-wing media might become disaffected. I think that's almost certainly not likely to happen, that one, because one of the other things about authoritarian morality, the philosophy of authoritarianism, is everything is a lie. And so the people, and we saw this directly in the Dominion voting machines lawsuit against Fox News Channel, that, the Fox News Channel people did not believe that Joe Biden or Democrats stole the election from Donald Trump. They thought that it was absurd, it was stupid, it was ridiculous, and obviously false. But nonetheless, they said otherwise in public, and so there, and that was ultimately one of the other reasons why I had to get out of right-wing media, was that there was just this oppressive censorship that goes on, and I saw it directly sometimes that people would say, "Oh, you can't write about so and so because one of our donors
likes that person,
or one of those our donors hates that person. So you can't write about that person. And but even then, like there is just the kind of this more indirect thing that, telling people the truth. And the Fox executives explicitly said that we have to respect our audience. And that was their code for we have to lie to them. That they want to be told things that they believe which are not true. They want to be lied to. So, that type of soulless attitude is completely pervasive now in right-wing media since Trump came along. There used to be a tad bit more independence, but now that's gone. Like RedState.com actually fired some bloggers who were Trump critical, who didn't like Trump because they thought it was bad for their business. So those people got fired, even though they were some of their most popular writers. And that, so that sort of pressure happens all the time. But I would say, there is disaffection that is happening, and we can see that with the prolonged campaign of Nikki Haley, that, even though everybody knows she's not going to win, she's still getting about the same percentage of the vote that she did, before, when in New Hampshire or South Carolina. And actually she won the primary in Washington, D.C. just a few days ago. And, and so the thing that will be interesting to see, though, is, very obviously there's somewhere between, let's say, 25 to 40% of Republicans who are just tired of Donald Trump for whatever reason. And, it's going to be interesting to see, well, what do they do in the general election? Are they going to, come back home as they always do? Or are they going to think for themselves? And because, conservatism, I don't think is inherently authoritarian, but it slots nicely into it. And so, because when you have this idea that order should be the sort of preeminent organizing principle of society, well, that's, authoritarians are very happy to give you order. That's what they specialize in. And so, I would love to see, because the root cause of so much of our political problems are the identity theft of conservatism by authoritarianism, such that, and it's very different because, when there was communism and socialism as more, things that were out there, having parties and trying to gain adherence in governments, they saw themselves and they marketed themselves as distinct from liberalism or progressivism. They said, no, we're not those people. We are our own thing. Whereas in this 21st century, the authoritarians all say that they're conservatives. And so it makes it easier for them to gain currency by doing that. And it also makes it easier for people who are conservative themselves to think, well, I'm not like those people, so I guess I must be a moderate. And as a result, they don't fight the people who are in their own party, destroying it from within. So, it would be interesting to see whether conservatism can, even a minority of them can wake up and understand what's happening to them and not go along with it. I don't know, though. It would be
right. Yeah. And that sort of speaks to the way that's within authoritarian evangelical circles and authoritarian political circles. These types of unspoken orthodoxies, the types of things that, whatever the boundaries are, testing them often comes with a lot of personal risk. And so it's always interesting to know where those boundaries have been, where they've been moved to, who moved them, those types of things. And it's intellectually fascinating, but can be alarming at the same time based on just its effects, all of its downstream effects of how it changes our politics from day to day. And these sorts of things are endlessly fascinating to me. I'm so thankful that you've spent part of your day with me, Matthew. Thank you for sharing about your personal story as well as your work. Where can people find your work online? You've got multiple podcasts. If you could share a little bit about some of your projects.
Sure. Well, it's all taking place under Flux. So people can go check us out at flux.community for that. And the 3 podcasts that I've got, I try to make them all different from each other to kind of show a different facet of myself as well. So the first one that I started chronologically was Theory of Change, and actually you've been on there. So
yeah, that'll be in the show notes, so you can check that out.
Yeah, and that one is an interview-based show where we kind of dive, and sometimes panel, but where we dive really deep into it, kind of generally only one subject per episode, and really dig deep to inside. And I try to vary it also because in terms of the subject matter. So sometimes it's politics, sometimes it's religion, sometimes it's media, and sometimes it's technology. And because one of the problems I think of our moment is that everybody is kind of siloed in their expertise and don't understand that ideas, they don't respect those discrete academic disciplines. And so they intrude into each other's space. And so that's what that show is about. And then Doom Scroll is a comedy news panel show. So very different. It's hosted by, I co-hosted with a friend of mine named Lisa Curry, who is a professional club comedian. She's actually right now in the Netherlands doing some shows over there. And, we just talk about the news and crack some jokes about it because that old saying is true that if you're not laughing, then you're crying. So we'd rather laugh. And then the last one, we're on hiatus a little bit right now as my co-host is working on some other matters. So this just happened is about we don't have guests on that show usually, and co-hosting that one with Callie Holloway, who's a writer at the Daily Beast and The Nation, and we try to, it's a show about ideas and identities, and basically what we talk about the news, but also kind of poke at, some of the underlying motives that people have that are not often spoken. And also to build the idea of intersectionality and get people to understand that causes of injustice or injustice that affects one person actually affects many other people as well, even if they cannot directly perceive. Mm-hmm. So, and then, as I said earlier, I'm working on a book kind of talking about my experience, and because I want people to understand that, because there are a lot of these, this is what happened to me in my religious childhood or whatever. There are a lot of those books, and we need those, but I want to also tell that story, but also connect it to the political side of things. And I guess, given my own experience, I can do that and get people to understand, because I think, and people of this, who are in your audience certainly know this, that, people with extreme fundamentalist beliefs, they don't always wear them on their sleeves. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, there are a lot of people out there who are walking around with, very radical ideas and often a lot of pain because of those ideas. And we need to shine some light on those, and to not just to expose the people who are, have these hidden agendas, but also to help people escape from the oppression and the chains that bind their minds.
Yeah. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, it's been great.